After divorcing his poor wife at the Christmas party, the husband accelerated his luxury sedan through the muddy street outside the venue, deliberately splashing mud water on her cream-colored dress, while his mother and mistress laughed from the passenger seats, their champagne glasses raised in cruel celebration, completely unaware she's a secret trillionaire who had funded his entire business empire from offshore accounts he never knew existed. The divorced woman stood motionless on the sidewalk, her designer heels, worth more than his car payment, submerged in the dirty puddle, her expression unreadable as she watched the taillights disappear into the snowy December night. But her silence concealed a calculated fury that would dismantle everything they loved within 72 hours. His mother's diamond necklace, a family heirloom she wore with pride, had actually been purchased with his ex-wife's money 3 Christmases ago, but none of them knew. The receipts were stored in a vault downtown, alongside documents that would destroy their social standing forever. The mistress, a blonde socialite who believed she'd won the ultimate prize, had no idea her new boyfriend's penthouse apartment, his country club membership, and even the engagement ring he'd promised her were all financed through accounts controlled by the woman they'd just humiliated. What kind of revenge could a secret trillionaire orchestrate against a family who never suspected her true identity? How completely would their world collapse when the woman they called poor revealed she owned the very ground they stood on? What did she do next that crushed them so thoroughly they could never recover? The mud water dripped from Elena Morrison's coat onto the sidewalk as she watched the Mercedes disappear around the corner, its taillights blinking mockingly through the snowfall. But her hands remained steady as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd programmed years ago for exactly this moment. The Christmas party continued inside the Grand Sterling Hotel, music and laughter spilling through the ornate windows, oblivious to the destruction about to unfold in the decorated ballroom, where her ex-husband Blake Ashford had just humiliated her in front of 200 guests. But the party would be very different in exactly 47 minutes. 5 years earlier, Elena had walked into that same hotel for her wedding reception, a 24-year-old heiress who'd inherited her grandfather's technology patents and manufacturing empire, but she'd signed every document under her mother's maiden name, Morrison, keeping her billionaire family identity buried under layers of legal protections her grandfather had established before his death. Her grandfather, Thomas Castellano, had built a fortune worth $7 billion through semiconductor innovations in the 1970s, but he'd watched his daughter, Elena's mother, marry a man who only wanted the money, resulting in a bitter divorce that taught him wealth attracted predators, but true character revealed itself only in perceived poverty. "Test them first," her grandfather had whispered from his hospital bed 3 months before Elena met Blake, his liver failing but his mind sharp as surgical steel. "Find someone who loves you when they think you have nothing, but if they fail the test, make sure you document everything, because betrayal always reveals itself eventually." Elena had followed his advice perfectly, but she'd underestimated how deeply betrayal could cut. When it finally arrived wearing a red cocktail dress and her mother-in-law's approving smile. The phone rang twice before her attorney answered, his voice crisp despite the late hour. "Ms. Castellano, I've been expecting your call since I saw the social media posts 17 minutes ago, but I assume you're ready to proceed with Protocol Omega." "Execute everything," Elena said quietly, wiping mud from her cheek with the back of her hand, but her voice carried the weight of absolute authority that came from controlling assets across 4 continents. Blake's business accounts, his mother's trust fund, the mistress's employment contracts, everything we discussed. I want them to wake up tomorrow owning nothing, but thinking they still have everything until the precise moment reality crushes them. The attorney's keyboard clicked rapidly in the background, executing commands that would transfer ownership of corporations, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios while their targets slept peacefully. but the legal mechanism had been prepared for months, waiting for Elena's final authorization. "The paperwork is already filed with the courts, Miss Castellano, but the injunctions won't be served until 8 a.m. tomorrow. Should I proceed with the media strategy?" "Release everything to the business journals at 7, Elena confirmed, watching a taxi approach through the snow, but she waved it past because she wasn't finished standing in this spot where her marriage had ended. "I want Blake to see the headlines before his mother calls him, but I want his mother to receive the foreclosure notice before she can warn him." Inside the Mercedes, Blake Ashford gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white despite the euphoria pumping through his veins. But his mistress, Amber Hastings, traced her finger along his jaw and whispered promises about their future, together in his penthouse overlooking the harbor. His mother, Patricia Ashford, sat in the back seat, scrolling through her phone, texting friends about her son's liberation from that poor little nobody who trapped him with puppy dog eyes and fake modesty. But none of them noticed the black SUV that had followed them from the hotel, maintaining a discreet distance while its dashboard camera recorded every word through sophisticated audio equipment. "I still can't believe she actually thought she deserved half of your assets," Amber laughed, adjusting the diamond bracelet Blake had given her last week, purchased, unknowingly, with a credit card funded by Elena's offshore account. "Your lawyer destroyed her in the settlement negotiations, but watching you drench her in mud was absolutely poetic." Blake's smile widened as he recalled Elena's shocked expression when the muddy water hit her, but he'd been planning that moment for weeks, ever since Amber convinced him that publicly humiliating his wife would cement his reputation as someone who refused to be controlled by sentiment. "She came from nothing and she's going back to nothing, but at least she got 5 years of living in my world before reality caught up with her." Patricia laughed from the back seat, her voice sharp with satisfaction that came from years of resenting her daughter-in-law's quiet dignity. "I told you on your wedding day she was wrong for you, Blake, but you were too blinded by her innocent act to see she was just a gold digger with better manners than most. Now you're free to marry someone from our social circle, someone who understands how our world works." The conversation continued as Blake drove toward his penthouse, but none of them knew Elena had purchased the building 3 years ago through a Vancouver-based real estate corporation, making her their landlord while they believed Blake owned the property through his technology consulting firm. The firm itself, Ashford Digital Solutions, had grown from a struggling startup to a $50 million company during Blake's marriage. But every major contract had been secured through Elena's connections, every investor introduced through her network, every crisis resolved with her money, all while Blake believed his charm and business acumen had built the empire. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees when Elena finally turned away from the street where her marriage had ended, but she felt nothing except the cold clarity that came from years of careful preparation meeting its destined moment. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, a conversation from her 16th birthday, when he'd first explained the family fortune and the responsibility it carried. "Money is a magnifying glass, Elena, but it makes small people smaller and great people greater. The question you must always ask is whether someone loves you or loves what you can provide, but most people can't distinguish between the two until tested under pressure." She'd tested Blake thoroughly, but he'd failed in ways she never anticipated. Their marriage had begun with genuine affection on her part, but Elena had maintained her cover story flawlessly. She claimed to be an orphan raised by a distant aunt who'd passed away, working as a part-time bookkeeper with minimal savings and no family connections. Blake had seemed charmed by her modesty, her reluctance to accept expensive gifts, her insistence on contributing to their household despite her limited income, but Elena now recognized those early months as the only honest period of their relationship. The shift had begun 18 months into their marriage when Blake's consulting firm landed its first major contract, a digital transformation project for a pharmaceutical company worth $12 million. But Blake never questioned why the CEO had specifically requested his unknown firm for such a crucial project. Elena had orchestrated the entire arrangement through her seat on the pharmaceutical company's board, using a proxy to recommend Blake's firm, providing him the opportunity to prove himself, but also testing whether success would change his character. It had changed everything, but not in ways that revealed his true nature immediately. Blake had started working longer hours, attending more social events, joining the country club where Patricia had maintained membership for 30 years. But he'd also started questioning why Elena didn't upgrade her wardrobe, why she drove a 10-year-old Honda instead of leasing something appropriate for a successful consultant's wife, why she seemed content with their modest lifestyle, when he was obviously destined for greater things. The questions had seemed innocent initially, but they carried an underlying resentment that grew stronger with each new contract, each new investor meeting, each step up the social ladder that Blake climbed while Elena deliberately remained behind. "You're embarrassing me," Blake had finally said one evening, after a charity gala where Elena wore a department store dress while other wives modeled designer gowns. "I'm trying to build something here, but you're making it look like I can't even afford to dress my own wife properly. People are starting to ask questions about why you're so cheap." Elena had absorbed the criticism in silence, but she'd increased her financial support of his business while maintaining her carefully constructed poverty, channeling money through investors who praised Blake's vision while never mentioning the silent partner who'd made their investments possible. She'd wanted to believe his frustration came from love, from a desire to share his success with her. But his next words had shattered that illusion completely. "Maybe you're just not cut out for this level of society," Blake had continued, his voice cold in a way she'd never heard before. "You grew up poor, and you'll always think poor, but I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger if you just let me transform you into someone appropriate for my lifestyle." The word appropriate had echoed in Elena's mind for days afterward, but she'd maintained her role while instructing her attorneys to begin documenting every financial transfer, every business decision, every interaction that might prove useful if their marriage continued deteriorating. Her grandfather's warning had proven prophetic. Betrayal was revealing itself slowly, but the full picture required patience and meticulous record-keeping that would withstand any legal challenge. Amber Hastings had entered their lives 9 months ago at a technology conference in Boston, but Elena had immediately recognized the predatory interest in the pharmaceutical sales representative's eyes when Blake introduced them at the networking reception. Amber's background check, conducted by Elena's security team within hours, revealed a pattern of targeting successful married men, initiating affairs that led to divorces, then moving on when the financial settlements proved disappointing. But Elena had decided to let the affair develop naturally while her investigators documented every hotel meeting, every romantic text message, every promise Blake made about their future together. "Let them think they're getting away with it," Elena's head of security had advised during a briefing 3 months ago. "Blake's transferring company assets into personal accounts he thinks you don't know about, but every transfer creates evidence we can use. The longer this continues, the stronger your case becomes." Elena had agreed, but the emotional toll of watching her husband fall in love with another woman while treating her with increasing contempt had tested her resolve in ways her grandfather never anticipated. She'd lie awake at night listening to Blake's phone buzz with messages from Amber, watching him smile at the screen while ignoring Elena's presence entirely. But she'd maintained her composure because the alternative, revealing her true identity and destroying him immediately, would have been less satisfying than the comprehensive demolition she'd planned. Patricia's involvement had added another dimension to Elena's strategy, but her mother-in-law's cruelty had made the revenge more personal than Elena initially intended. Patricia had treated Elena like a servant from their first meeting, assigning her errands and household tasks, while making clear that Blake had married beneath his station. But Patricia's own financial situation was far more precarious than she'd admitted to anyone. The Ashford family fortune, such as it was, had been depleted 2 generations earlier through bad investments and expensive divorces, but Patricia maintained appearances through a combination of credit cards, a modest trust fund from her own mother, and the generosity of friends who didn't realize her designer wardrobe came from consignment shops, and her jewelry was mostly cubic zirconia. Elena had discovered Patricia's financial desperation within weeks of meeting her, but instead of exposing the hypocrisy, she'd quietly arranged for Patricia's trust fund to receive an anonymous infusion of capital that kept her afloat, all while Patricia continued, insulting the daughter-in-law who'd saved her from bankruptcy. That's the problem with people like Elena, Patricia had told Blake during a lunch Elena wasn't supposed to overhear. They think being nice entitles them to our respect, but respect is earned through breeding and accomplishment, not through pathetic attempts to please everyone. You need to divorce her before she gets pregnant and traps you permanently. Blake had divorced her instead 3 months later, but not before Patricia introduced him to Amber at a country club dinner, facilitating the affair while congratulating herself for saving her son from a woman she considered inferior in every measurable way. The Christmas party had been Blake's idea, but Patricia and Amber had helped plan every humiliating detail. The public divorce announcement disguised as a toast, the legal papers served by a waiter delivering champagne, the entire country club society watching as Elena's marriage dissolved in front of their judgmental eyes. Blake had expected tears, begging, maybe even a dramatic scene that would further justify his decision, but Elena had simply signed the papers without reading them, gathered her coat, and walked toward the exit while 200 guests whispered about the poor woman who'd finally been exposed as unworthy of Blake Ashford's dynasty. The mudwater had been Blake's spontaneous addition to the humiliation, but Amber had encouraged him as he accelerated toward the puddle, her laughter mixing with Patricia's as they watched Elena stumble backward from the impact. They'd driven away believing they'd delivered the final blow to a woman who'd never fought back, never defended herself, never showed any capacity for retaliation, but they'd confused restraint with weakness, patience with powerlessness, and that mistake would cost them everything they valued. Elena stood in the hotel lobby now, ignoring the curious stares from departing party guests who'd witnessed her humiliation, but her phone buzzed with updates from her legal team as they executed the complex sequence of asset transfers and corporate restructuring she'd prepared over months of careful planning. Blake's company accounts were being frozen under court order, his personal investment seized for fraud investigation, his penthouse deed transferred back to the offshore corporation that actually owned it. But these were merely the opening moves in a chess game where Elena controlled every piece on the board. Ms. Castellano, the media packets are ready for distribution, her publicist confirmed via text message. We have documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every affair detail, every instance where Blake used company funds for personal expenses. The business journals are running the story at 7 a.m., but the tabloids want to publish online within the hour. Elena typed her response carefully, aware that her next decisions would determine how thoroughly Blake's reputation would be destroyed. Wait until morning. I want them to have one last night of celebration before they understand what they've lost. But make sure the story includes Patricia's financial dependence on the trust fund I've been secretly funding. She should know her son married a trillionaire who paid for her lifestyle while she called me poor. The Grand Sterling Hotel had been the site of Elena's wedding reception 5 years ago, but it would now host the final act of her marriage's dissolution, and she'd timed everything to occur in this same building where Blake had expected to celebrate his freedom. The hotel's ballroom rental for tomorrow morning, supposedly for a corporate breakfast meeting, was actually reserved for a press conference where Elena would reveal her true identity, announce her control of Blake's business empire, and detail the charity work she'd funded anonymously during her marriage, including the cancer treatment that saved Patricia's life. "They thought I was poor," Elena whispered to herself, watching snow accumulate on the hotel's front steps. "They thought I needed them, but they were parasites feeding on resources they never knew existed. Now they'll learn what it means to lose everything, because they couldn't recognize value when it stood beside them." Her head of security emerged from a black SUV parked near the entrance, his expression grim but satisfied as he handed Elena a tablet displaying video footage from inside Blake's Mercedes. "We recorded the entire conversation after they left the hotel, Ms. Castellano, but I have to warn you that some of what they said is particularly cruel. Are you sure you want to watch this tonight?" Elena took the tablet without hesitation, her fingers steady as she pressed play, but the audio that filled her ears confirmed every suspicion she'd harbored about Blake's true character. He wasn't just celebrating freedom from a marriage he found burdensome. He was actively mocking her poverty, her appearance, her supposed dependence on his generosity, all while Amber and Patricia encouraged his contempt with their own vicious commentary. "She actually believed I loved her," Blake's voice crackled through the tablet speakers. "Can you imagine being that delusional? I needed a wife who wouldn't ask questions while I built my business, but I always planned to upgrade once I achieved the success I deserved. Elena was just a placeholder, a warm body who cooked dinner and stayed quiet while I made real connections." Amber's laughter followed, sharp and delighted in its cruelty. "She's probably crying in some bus station right now, trying to figure out where she'll sleep tonight, but that's not your problem anymore. You gave her 5 years of luxury she never could have afforded on her own, so really she should be thanking you for the experience." Patricia's voice joined, the chorus, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "I knew from the moment I met her that she wasn't good enough for you, Blake, but you were determined to prove you could save some pathetic little nobody from obscurity. Well, you tried, and she failed to rise to the occasion, so now you're free to marry someone worthy of the Ashford name." Elena stopped the playback, her chest tight with emotions she'd suppressed for months, but the pain was giving way to something colder and more focused, a determination to ensure these 3 people never forgot the name they'd mocked with such casual cruelty. She'd given Blake every opportunity to love her authentically, supported his business despite his growing contempt, funded his mother's lifestyle while enduring her insults, all because some part of her wanted to believe marriage meant partnership, but she'd been married to a stranger who'd worn a mask until success allowed him to reveal his true face. "Send the footage to my attorney," Elena instructed, handing the tablet back to her security chief. "I want it included in the press conference materials tomorrow, but also send copies to Blake's largest investors and board members. They should know the character of the man running their company before they read about the fraud charges." The security chief nodded, but his expression softened with concern. "Ms. Castellano, are you certain you want to go this far? There are legal remedies that don't require public humiliation, but once this information goes public, there's no walking it back." Elena met his eyes steadily, her voice calm but implacable. "They humiliated me publicly, mocked my poverty while spending my money, celebrated destroying someone they believed was powerless to fight back. But their mistake was assuming weakness when they saw restraint. I want the world to know what kind of people they are, and I want them to live with the consequences of underestimating someone based on her bank balance." Blake's penthouse apartment occupied the entire 40th floor of Harbor Tower, a building Elena had purchased through a Vancouver real estate corporation 3 years earlier when Blake's consulting firm secured its largest contract, another deal Elena had arranged through her board position with the client company, but Blake believed he'd won through his own merit and charm. The penthouse had been Blake's dream, a symbol of his rising status in Boston's business community. But he'd never questioned how he'd qualified for the mortgage on a consultant's salary, never wondered why the building's property management company was so accommodating about his occasional late payments, never suspected his wife owned the building and had instructed management to treat him like a valued tenant while documenting every financial irregularity. "I can't believe this is really ours now," Amber said as Blake unlocked the door, her voice breathy with excitement as she stepped into the marble foyer where a Christmas tree stood decorated with ornaments Blake had charged to a credit card Elena secretly paid off each month. No more sneaking around, no more lies, just us building the life we deserve together. Blake pulled her close, his hands on her waist, as he kissed her with the passion he'd never shown Elena during their final year of marriage. But his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, displaying a message from his business partner that he ignored, in favor of pouring champagne for his mother and mistress. Patricia settled onto the leather sofa, purchased with Elena's money through Blake's corporate account, and raised her glass in another toast to her son's liberation from inappropriate entanglements. "To Blake's future," Patricia announced, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandelier overhead. "May he never again be burdened by someone who doesn't appreciate the privilege of his attention, but instead build the empire he deserves, with a partner who enhances rather than diminishes his reputation." They drank deeply, their laughter echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, but none of them noticed the building's security cameras were recording everything, feeding live footage to Elena's security team, who documented each moment of their celebration for the legal proceedings that would begin in exactly 9 hours. Blake's business partner had sent 17 messages in the past 30 minutes, each more urgent than the last, but Blake was too intoxicated by victory to recognize warning signs that would have been obvious to someone paying attention. "We should start planning the wedding," Amber suggested, curling against Blake on the sofa while Patricia smiled approvingly from her chair. "Something spectacular at the country club, maybe in the spring when the gardens are in bloom, but definitely something that makes a statement about our place in society." Blake nodded enthusiastically, his mind already calculating the guest list and the social connections he could leverage through a high-profile wedding, but he had no idea the country club membership he'd held for 2 years was funded through an anonymous corporate sponsorship Elena had arranged, making her the silent benefactor of the institution where his mother had introduced him to his mistress. The irony would have been poetic if it wasn't so devastatingly complete. Elena had paid for every aspect of the life Blake believed he'd built through his own merit, subsidized every luxury his mother and mistress enjoyed, all while they treated her with contempt for her perceived poverty. "I'm thinking we should take a trip to celebrate," Blake announced suddenly, pulling out his phone to browse vacation destinations. "Somewhere tropical, maybe the Maldives or Bora Bora, just to cleanse ourselves of the past 5 years and start fresh. I'll use the company account. We just closed a major deal last week, so there's plenty of capital for a celebration." Patricia clapped her hands together, her eyes bright with anticipation. "That sounds perfect, Blake, but make sure you book something luxurious. You've spent 5 years pretending to be satisfied with Elena's penny-pinching mentality, so now it's time to live the way you deserve. First-class flights, overwater bungalows, the works." Amber was already scrolling through resort websites, her voice rising with excitement as she found properties that cost $15,000 per night. But none of them realized Blake's company account had been frozen 30 minutes ago by court order, his credit cards declined, his access to corporate funds severed by emergency injunctions. Elena's attorneys had filed in 3 separate jurisdictions. They were planning a celebration with money that no longer existed, booking a future that had already been dismantled, building dreams on a foundation Elena had removed while they laughed about her humiliation. The night wore on with increasing intoxication and decreasing awareness. But Blake's phone continued buzzing with ignored messages from his business partner, his accountant, and several investors who'd somehow learned about irregularities in the company's financial statements. Patricia fell asleep in the guest bedroom around 2 a.m., her diamond necklace, purchased with Elena's money, still clasped around her neck, while Blake and Amber stumbled to the master bedroom where they collapsed onto sheets Elena had never shared with her husband during the final months of their marriage. "This is the life I was meant to live," Blake murmured before sleep claimed him, his arm draped over Amber's shoulder. "Success, beauty, freedom from mediocrity, everything I deserved but was too trapped to claim. Thank God I finally had the courage to cut loose the dead weight." Amber murmured agreement, her mind already planning how she'd redecorate the penthouse to reflect her own taste, but neither of them heard the lock click in the front door at 3 a.m. when building security changed the access codes under instructions from the property's owner, Elena Morrison Castellano, whose name would appear on the eviction notice scheduled for delivery at 8 a.m., when the full scope of their destroyed lives would finally become impossible to ignore. Elena spent the night in a suite at the Four Seasons, a hotel she owned through another shell corporation, but she didn't sleep despite the luxury surroundings and the satisfaction of knowing her plan was proceeding flawlessly. Instead, she sat by the window watching snow fall over the city, remembering moments from her marriage when she'd believed Blake capable of genuine love, when she'd hoped his character would withstand the test her grandfather had warned her to administer. But those memories felt distant now, belonging to a different person who'd existed before tonight's final betrayal. Her phone displayed updates throughout the night as her legal team executed each phase of Protocol Omega, the comprehensive revenge strategy she'd named after the last letter of the Greek alphabet, symbolizing the end of her tolerance for abuse and the beginning of consequences for those who'd mistaken her patience for weakness. Blake's business accounts, frozen and under investigation for fraud, his personal investments, seized under emergency court order pending review of their origins, his credit cards, declined worldwide after Elena's financial institutions cut off the funding streams she'd quietly maintained for years, his penthouse. Ownership transferred back to Elena's corporation with eviction proceedings initiated for unauthorized occupants. His country club membership, terminated after the anonymous corporate sponsor withdrew support and revealed 5 years of unpaid dues covered by charitable donation. Patricia's trust fund received similar treatment, but Elena had structured her revenge to maximize the psychological impact rather than simply destroying their finances. Patricia would wake up to discover her trust fund frozen, her credit cards declined, her bank accounts emptied by legal judgments for fraudulent claims against an anonymous benefactor, but she wouldn't immediately understand that the benefactor had been Elena, the daughter-in-law she'd treated like a servant for 5 years, while secretly depending on her generosity for survival. The press conference is scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Grand Sterling Hotel. Elena's publicist confirmed via text message at 6 a.m. "We have representatives from the Wall Street Journal, Boston Business Review, Forbes, and several local news outlets confirmed to attend, but the story is already leaking through social media. Someone at the courthouse recognized your name on the legal filings and posted about it online." Elena smiled grimly, watching dawn break over the Boston skyline, but she felt no joy in the destruction she'd orchestrated, only grim satisfaction that justice would finally be served to people who'd believed themselves beyond consequences. Her grandfather had warned her that testing people would sometimes reveal ugliness she couldn't unsee, but he'd also taught her that allowing that ugliness to continue without accountability made her complicit in its perpetuation. At 7 a.m., the first news stories began publishing online, with headlines that would end Blake's business career and destroy Patricia's social standing permanently. Local tech CEO built empire on secret trillionaire wife's money while publicly humiliating her. read the Wall Street Journal's headline, accompanied by detailed financial documentation showing every investment, every contract, every business success Blake had claimed as his own achievement, but had actually been engineered by Elena through her network of corporate connections. The Boston Business Review's story focused on Patricia's financial dependence on the daughter-in-law she'd mocked, revealing years of trust fund bailouts and anonymous charitable donations that had kept the Ashford matriarch afloat while she publicly derided Elena's perceived poverty. Forbes published the most damaging story, a profile of Elena Morrison Castellano that revealed her true identity as heir to the Castellano technology fortune, her grandfather's $7 billion estate, her strategic investments across multiple industries, but most devastatingly, her 5-year marriage to Blake Ashford, conducted entirely under an assumed identity to test his character and integrity. Trillionaire heiress discovers husband married her for money that didn't exist, the headline read, and the article detailed every humiliation Elena had endured, while secretly funding the lifestyle her husband used to attract his mistress and celebrate his mother's contempt. Blake woke at 7:30 to 17. Voicemails from panicked investors, 43 text messages from his business partner screaming about frozen accounts, and a dozen news alerts on his phone showing his face beneath headlines that destroyed everything he'd built. His hand trembled as he opened the first article, his eyes scanning words that seemed impossible, but were documented with financial records he couldn't deny. Evidence that his entire business success was manufactured by the wife he'd divorced, the woman he'd splashed with mud water while his mother and mistress laughed at her supposed poverty. "Amber," Blake croaked, shaking his mistress awake with hands that had gone numb with shock. "Amber, wake up. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." Amber stirred slowly, her eyes opening to find Blake's face pale with terror. But before she could ask what happened, her own phone began buzzing with messages from her employer, her colleagues, her friends, all demanding to know if the stories about her affair with a married tech CEO were true. Her pharmaceutical company had terminated her employment at 7 a.m., citing moral turpitude clauses in her contract. But worse, the stories revealed that her employer's largest research grant came from the Castellano Foundation, the charitable organization Elena controlled, making Amber's affair with Elena's husband a violation of ethics policies that would blacklist her from the pharmaceutical industry permanently. Patricia's phone woke her at 7:45 with a call from her attorney, but she answered with annoyance rather than concern, expecting some routine legal matter that could wait until after her leisurely breakfast at the country club. "This better be important, Richard," she snapped into the phone. "I'm meeting friends at 9 and I need time to get ready." "Patricia, your trust fund has been seized," her attorney said without preamble, his voice tight with stress. "There are court judgments against you for fraudulent claims against an anonymous benefactor, but that's not the worst part. The benefactor has been revealed as Elena Castellano, and the media is reporting that she's been funding your lifestyle for 5 years while you publicly mocked her poverty. Your country club membership has been terminated, your credit cards are declined, and you're facing potential criminal charges for fraud against a charitable foundation." Patricia dropped the phone, her hand flying to her chest as her heart raced with panic. But the diamond necklace she'd worn to bed suddenly felt like a noose around her throat, because she remembered Blake mentioning that Elena had admired it 3 Christmases ago. The necklace wasn't a family heirloom passed down through generations of Ashfords. It was a gift from Blake purchased with money Elena had provided, a symbol of Patricia's dependence on the woman she'd treated like garbage for half a decade. The 3 of them gathered in Blake's living room at 8 a.m., their phones buzzing constantly with calls they couldn't bring themselves to answer. But the full scope of their destruction became clear as news story after news story revealed details They'd never known about Elena's true identity and her comprehensive documentation of their betrayals. Blake's business partner sent a final message at 8:15. The board voted to remove you as CEO effective immediately. The company is being dissolved and its assets transferred to the Castellano Foundation as restitution for fraud. We're all facing legal action because of your lies, but you're going to prison while the rest of us just lose our careers. How is this possible? Blake whispered, staring at his phone as another news alert appeared showing video footage from inside his Mercedes the previous night. Him, Amber, and Patricia laughing about Elena's poverty while splashing her with mud water. Their cruel words about her supposed worthlessness preserved in high-definition audio that was now being broadcast across every news outlet in the country. She was poor. She had nothing. I checked her background before we got married. She was an orphan with no family, no money, no connections. How could she be a trillionaire? Amber pulled up another article on her tablet, this one from a technology industry journal, explaining Elena's grandfather's patent empire and the sophisticated legal structures he'd created to protect his granddaughter from fortune hunters. But the story also revealed that every major business deal Blake had closed during his marriage came through board members and investors who'd been personally recruited by Elena using her real identity. She was testing you, Amber read aloud, her voice hollow with dawning comprehension. Her grandfather, Thomas Castellano, established a trust that required his heir to marry while concealing her wealth, documenting whether her spouse loved her authentically or only valued her for financial benefit. Blake Ashford failed that test spectacularly. Patricia sank onto the sofa, her face gray with shock as she processed the revelation that her son had been married to one of the wealthiest women in America while she'd treated that woman like a servant. But worse, that the cancer treatment that saved her life 18 months ago had been anonymously funded by Elena through a charitable foundation Patricia had never heard of until this moment. I called her poor, Patricia whispered, her hands shaking as she touched the diamond necklace that now felt like evidence of her own hypocrisy. I called her a gold digger and a social climber and a pathetic nobody, but she was paying for my chemotherapy while I insulted her at family dinners. The eviction notice arrived at 8:30, delivered by building security who no longer recognized Blake as a resident, but instead treated him as an unauthorized occupant of property owned by Elena Morrison Castellano through Harbor Properties, LLC. You have 4 hours to remove your personal belongings, the security officer read from the official document. Any items remaining after 12:30 p.m. will be disposed of as abandoned property. Please surrender your keys and access cards immediately. Blake stood frozen in the doorway, the eviction notice trembling in his hands as he realized the penthouse had never been his. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every maintenance fee had been paid by Elena while he believed himself a successful property owner. But she'd owned the building and had simply allowed him to live there as part of her test. Where are we supposed to go? He asked the security officer, his voice breaking with desperation. I have nowhere else to live. The security officer's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes held no sympathy for the man whose cruelty to his secret trillionaire wife had been broadcast across international media for the past hour. That's not my concern, sir, but I suggest you contact an attorney because there are federal marshals scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. to seize any corporate assets located on these premises. The press conference began at 9 a.m. in the Grand Sterling Hotel's largest ballroom, but Elena arrived early to walk through the same decorated halls where her marriage had ended the previous night, her steps echoing on the marble floors that had witnessed her humiliation but would now host her vindication. She'd changed from her mud-stained dress into a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Blake's monthly salary, her hair professionally styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, presenting the image of wealth and power she'd hidden for 5 years behind thrift store clothing and apologetic smiles. "We have over 200 media representatives registered," her publicist whispered as they entered the ballroom together. "This is the largest press turnout I've ever coordinated." But the story is already trending globally on social media. People are calling it the greatest revenge story in modern history. Elena took her position behind the podium, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone, but her heart raced with emotions she'd suppressed since her grandfather's death. Grief for the marriage that could have been, anger at the betrayal she'd endured, satisfaction that justice was finally being served, but also a profound sadness that testing people's character so often revealed the worst aspects of human nature rather than the best. "My name is Elena Morrison Castellano," she began, her voice clear and calm despite the chaos of camera flashes and reporter questions. "For the past 5 years, I've been married to Blake Ashford under an assumed identity, concealing my wealth to determine whether he loved me authentically or valued me only for what I could provide. The test was established by my grandfather, Thomas Castellano, who believed that true character reveals itself only when people believe they have power over someone they perceive as inferior." She paused, letting her words sink into the packed ballroom, but also giving herself a moment to steady her emotions before revealing the full extent of Blake's betrayal. Blake Ashford failed that test in every measurable way, but more importantly, he revealed a capacity for cruelty that extends beyond simple gold digging into active malice towards someone he believed was powerless to defend herself. "Last night, he divorced me publicly at a Christmas party, served me legal papers in front of 200 witnesses, then deliberately drove his car through a puddle to splash mud water on me, while his mother and mistress laughed at my humiliation." The room erupted with questions, but Elena raised her hand for silence, her expression stern as she continued. "What Blake didn't know was that every business success he achieved during our marriage was orchestrated by me through my corporate connections, funded by my offshore accounts, secured through investors I personally recruited. His consulting firm, Ashford Digital Solutions, never earned a single contract based on his merit alone. Every client was introduced through my board positions. Every investor convinced by my financial backing. Every crisis resolved with my money." She displayed the first financial document on the screens behind her, showing a complex web of corporate transfers that proved Blake's company was essentially a shell corporation funded entirely by Elena's resources, but the documentation was so thorough and the evidence so comprehensive that even Blake's most loyal supporters would have to acknowledge the truth. "I funded his lifestyle, paid his mother's medical bills, purchased the penthouse where he lived, subsidized his country club membership. Everything he claimed as evidence of his own success was actually evidence of my generosity and his exploitation." The questions grew louder, but Elena continued speaking over the noise, her voice rising with controlled fury as she detailed the final betrayals. "His mother, Patricia Ashford, spent 5 years mocking my poverty, while I secretly funded the trust fund that kept her from bankruptcy, paid for her cancer treatment through an anonymous charitable donation, provided the diamond necklace she wore while laughing at my humiliation last night. His mistress, Amber Hastings, seduced my husband while employed by a pharmaceutical company that receives its largest research grant from my family foundation, violating ethics policies that will end her career permanently." She showed the video footage from inside Blake's Mercedes, the audio playing through the ballroom speakers as her ex-husband's voice filled the room with his contempt for the wife he'd believed was poor and powerless. The assembled journalists gasped at the cruelty captured on camera, but Elena remained composed as she played the entire recording, letting Blake's own words condemn him more effectively than any accusation she could make. "Blake Ashford believed he was trading up when he divorced me for a blonde socialite who understood How our world works, Elena continued when the video ended. What he didn't understand is that I own his world, the building where he lives, the company where he works, the country club where his mother introduced him to his mistress. Everything he claimed as evidence of his superior status was actually built on my money and maintained through my tolerance. She paused again, her eyes scanning the crowd of journalists who hung on her every word. But she also thought about her grandfather watching from whatever afterlife existed beyond this moment of vindication. My grandfather warned me that testing people's character often reveals ugliness we'd rather not see. But he also taught me that allowing that ugliness to continue without consequences makes us complicit in perpetuating it. I gave Blake Ashford 5 years to prove he could love someone authentically rather than transactionally, but he proved instead that he valued power over partnership, status over substance, and cruelty over compassion. The final revelation came when Elena displayed documents showing that Blake had been systematically embezzling from his own company, the company she funded, believing he was stealing from investors who would never notice small discrepancies in quarterly reports. But every fraudulent transfer had been documented by Elena's forensic accountants and would now be prosecuted as federal crimes carrying sentences of up to 20 years in prison. Blake Ashford will face criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, Elena announced. His mother will face civil litigation for fraudulent claims against my charitable foundation. His mistress has been terminated from her employment and blacklisted from her industry for ethics violations. All 3 of them will spend years in legal proceedings that will cost them everything they have left, which, as of this morning, is nothing. The press conference lasted 90 minutes, but Elena answered every question with thorough documentation and calm precision that left no doubt about the truth of her claims or the comprehensive nature of her revenge. And by the time she stepped away from the podium, social media was exploding with support for the secret trillionaire who'd endured years of abuse while secretly controlling her abuser's entire existence. "She's a hero," one viral post declared. "She didn't just get revenge. She dismantled them so completely they'll never recover." Blake watched the press conference from a coffee shop, having been evicted from his penthouse by security officers who treated him like a criminal rather than a resident. But every word Elena spoke felt like a physical blow that crushed what remained of his dignity and his future. His business was destroyed, his reputation ruined, his assets seized, his freedom threatened by criminal charges that could send him to federal prison. But worse than any of that was the knowledge that he'd been married to someone extraordinary and had treated her like garbage because he couldn't recognize value when it existed beneath a carefully constructed disguise. "I loved you," Blake whispered to the television screen, showing Elena's composed face at the podium. "At the beginning, I really loved you." Amber stood beside him in the coffee shop, her career destroyed and her future uncertain, but she felt no sympathy for Blake's self-pity because she recognized his words as another lie he told himself to avoid confronting his own character flaws. "You loved what she let you believe about yourself," Amber corrected coldly. "You loved feeling superior to someone you thought was beneath you, but the moment you discovered she was infinitely above you, that love evaporated into resentment. Don't pretend this is a tragedy. It's just consequences for choices you made freely and enthusiastically." Patricia joined them at noon, having been refused entry to the country club where she'd planned to meet friends who no longer answered her calls. But her shock had evolved into something darker, a bitter fury at Elena for deceiving them all, for testing them without their knowledge, for punishing them so severely for behaviors Patricia believed were justified by their superior social status. "She had no right to trick us like that," Patricia insisted, her voice shrill with indignation. "If she'd been honest about her wealth from the beginning, we would have treated her appropriately, but she chose to lie, and then punished us for believing her lies. This is entrapment, not justice." Blake said nothing, but he understood what his mother refused to acknowledge. Elena had given them every opportunity to treat her with basic human decency, regardless of her perceived wealth. But they'd chosen cruelty over kindness because they believed her powerlessness made their contempt acceptable. The test hadn't been whether they would worship her money, but whether they could respect her humanity without financial incentive, and all three of them had failed that test so completely that Elena's revenge was less about vindictiveness than about demonstrating the consequences of their own choices. The legal proceedings began within days, but Elena's attorneys had prepared their cases so thoroughly that Blake's defense lawyers advised immediate plea agreements rather than trials that would only extend the public humiliation. And by the end of January, Blake had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for financial crimes that carried mandatory minimums and substantial evidence of premeditation. His mother faced civil judgments that would keep her in debt for the rest of her life, forced to liquidate every asset and live on a court-mandated budget that gave her a taste of the poverty she'd mocked in others, while Amber found herself unemployable in her industry and reduced to working retail jobs that paid minimum wage and offered no path back to the life she'd briefly enjoyed as Blake's mistress. Elena donated Blake's company to a nonprofit that trained disadvantaged youth in technology careers, turning his fraudulent enterprise into a vehicle for helping people from backgrounds similar to the poverty she'd pretended to experience. But she also established a scholarship fund in her grandfather's name that required recipients to document their character through community service and ethical behavior rather than simply demonstrating academic achievement. "Money magnifies who we already are," she told the scholarship recipients at the first award ceremony. "It makes generous people more generous and cruel people more cruel, but the real test of character is how we treat others when we believe they can't benefit us in return." The story became legendary in business circles, a cautionary tale about underestimating people based on appearances and treating others badly because you believe they're powerless to retaliate. But Elena rarely discussed it publicly after the initial press conference, preferring to let her actions speak louder than her words. She never remarried, having learned that her grandfather's test revealed too much ugliness in human nature to risk repeating the experiment, but she built a life focused on using her wealth to create opportunities for others rather than testing their character under false pretenses. Years later, a journalist asked Elena if she regretted the 5 years she'd spent being poor with Blake, if she wished she'd revealed her identity earlier and spared herself the humiliation. But Elena's answer surprised everyone who'd followed her story. "I regret that Blake, Patricia, and Amber failed the test," she said thoughtfully. "I regret that they were capable of such cruelty toward someone they believed was beneath them, but I don't regret learning the truth about their character, because living in ignorance while they exploited me would have been worse than 5 years of discomfort followed by permanent liberation." The Christmas party at the Grand Sterling Hotel became an annual tradition in Boston's business community, but it was now hosted by Elena's foundation and focused on celebrating people who demonstrated exceptional character rather than exceptional wealth. And every year on December 19th, Elena would stand in the ballroom where her marriage had ended and toast the woman she'd been when muddy water soaked her dress, the woman who'd endured humiliation with dignity, documented betrayal with precision, and ultimately crushed her abusers so thoroughly they never recovered, not through violence or illegality, but simply by revealing the truth about who controlled the world they thought they'd mastered. Blake's final years in prison were spent writing letters to Elena that she never read, apologies that came too late to matter, and excuses that revealed he still didn't understand why his actions deserved such comprehensive consequences. But Elena's assistant kept every letter in a file marked evidence of continued delusion, because some people never learn that character matters more than circumstance, and consequences are just the universe's way of teaching lessons that should have been obvious from the beginning. The mudwater had been Blake's last cruel gesture toward a wife he believed was powerless, but it became the symbol of Elena's ultimate triumph, the moment when she chose to stop pretending, stop tolerating, and stop protecting people from the consequences of their own cruelty. They'd laughed at her humiliation, celebrated her perceived poverty, mocked her for being beneath them, but their laughter turned to ashes when they discovered the poor wife they'd destroyed was actually a secret trillionaire who'd been documenting their betrayals with the patience of someone who knew that justice delayed was often justice amplified beyond measure. And in the end, what she did next didn't just crush them. It erased them from the world they'd valued so highly, replacing their names with cautionary tales and their achievements with footnotes about fraud, leaving them with nothing except the knowledge that they'd been given everything by the woman they'd treated like nothing, and that their destruction was ultimately their own creation, revealed through a test they never knew they were taking until they'd already failed it completely.